All right. Welcome, hello, welcome to Adam Answers Anything. It's Sunday, August 31st, the last day of August, and tomorrow is Labor Day. So happy Labor Day to everybody. If you're watching this for the first time, I'm Adam, and this is Adam Answers Anything. Not because I know everything, but because I love wrestling with difficult questions and I love alliteration. Thus, the full title of the show is Adam Answers Anything, or Adam Answers Absolutely Anything at All. So, welcome to the show. This is our 11th episode. I'm so excited that you've joined me tonight. I'm honored that you've joined me tonight. And I am excited to be diving into tonight's question. But before I do, just a couple of quick notes, just two quick things. The first thing is, if you would like to ask a question, there is a QR code right up there. Feel free to scan that QR code. And, I think I'm going to start putting the link actually in the description as well. So look out for that in the description too. But there's a form, Google form you go fill out, and you can ask any question, and I will wrestle with your question live on the stream. And there's also an option for you to pick whether or not you would actually want to be on the show with me to wrestle with the question, which I would absolutely love to do. So if you have a question, a burning question that you'd love to wrestle with, and especially if you would love to be on the show and join me in wrestling with your question together, I would highly encourage you to go ahead and scan that QR code, fill out the form. I would love to see your question. I would love to see your submission. Second thing is, in any episode, this is our 11th episode. In any episode, I would love to hear your perspective. Each episode is it's just me talking, and so I would love to hear you talk even more than I enjoy hearing myself talk, which I don't enjoy hearing myself talk that much anyway. So I would love to hear what you have to say. So leave a comment down below, or even better, drop something down in the chat. I would love to hear your perspective, your interpretation, what your thoughts are on any of the questions that I've wrestled with, and especially during the live stream. Don't be feel free to leave a comment down below or to leave something in the chat and just share maybe a little bit about your perspective about what it is that we're walking through. Maybe you disagree about one of the points that I've made. I would love to hear that, and I would love to hear more about what your perspective is, what your different perspective is, because at the end of the day, I think that's the beautiful thing about conversations, about questions, is that there are often so many different ways to answer it and different ways to see it. And so I love to hear those. Third thing is, like and subscribe. I don't think I mentioned that enough in my live streams, but if you're here, first of all, thank you very much. And second of all, if you enjoy the content, awesome. Thank you so much. If you enjoy the content, I really appreciate you. But feel free to leave a like and feel free to hit that subscribe button. It really does help me. Because not only does it help my channel, but it also helps me and lets me know that people enjoy the content, that they're engaging with the content that I'm making, and it encourages me to continue making it and to keep going with it. And so if you feel led, feel free to do that. It really does go a long way. And I'm super excited for anyone who joins me, whether or not they subscribe. So, all right, with those out of the way, we're going to jump into tonight's question. The question is already up there on your screen. Usually I try to hide it beforehand, but most of the time I forget. So tonight's question is, put simply, do multiple worlds exist? Let me just double check that the music is, and it's not. Okay. I always forget to mute the music before I start talking. And so just want to make sure I do that because sometimes it can be distracting. Do multiple worlds exist? Interesting question. It's one that you may have wrestled with before. For some of you, it's maybe a question that you've never even considered before. For some of you, you might be thinking, "Oh yeah, there's that one Marvel movie where they went to different worlds." That's related to it. But what as with any question that we wrestle with, the first thing that we need to do is to tackle the question itself. What is it that we mean when we ask the question, do many worlds exist? What do we mean by many worlds? Well, there are different ways I think to interpret that question, to interpret what do we mean by worlds. But the one we're going to start out with is the one that I I believe is very plainly being asked by the question. It's when we ask the question, I think this is what it means. I think what it means is, are there other worlds? Okay, for example, let's just give a practical example. Let's say there's another Earth, and that Earth is just like the one that we live on, but there's minute differences. Maybe the atom in this other world has blonde hair, or maybe in another different world, that atom is a lawyer. I think that's what we mean. That there are many. When we say many, I believe the assumption is infinite. There's a seemingly infinite number of worlds with infinite number of arrangements of circumstances and perspective and possibilities and situations that exist on the infinite number of possible Earths in which Earths in which there exist an infinite number of possibilities. So, because there's an infinite number of worlds, there's a world out there in the infinite possibilities that where everything is absolutely the same, but the only thing that's different is that I'm wearing a red shirt right now. But then there's possible worlds out there that are so wildly different that, I'm I'm a doctor and I'm living in Australia or something like that, where there's just completely wildly different atom. I believe that's what we mean, or that's what the question means when it asks, "Do many worlds exist?" So is it not just a hypothetical thing, but isn't an actual thing? Like, are there actual different universes? Are there actual different worlds which actually exist? I think that's the question that we're wrestling with, and we're actually going to look at a different way to interpret the question later on. As usual, we're going to wrestle with the question in three unique ways. So three major points. That seems to be our theme. This is the 11th episode. We have done that almost every single episode. Wrestle with the question in three major points. The first point that we're going to cover is we're going to talk a bit about the scientific perspective. So, what does science? When we say science, what we mean is what does what does the empirical discipline of science have to say about this question? So what would data, what would observation, what would that, how would that answer the question? We come to the many worlds interpretation, right? So, do many worlds exist? Well, in science, we might call that the many worlds interpretation. Well, what's the many worlds interpretation? It is an interpretation of quantum physics. It's an interpretation which suggests that every quantum event that occurs. It indeed occurs, and it branches reality into a parallel reality which exists alongside our own. That's what many worlds interpretations would say. Now, quantum physics, if I mean, again, I am not a quantum physicist, so I just want to put that out there. But quantum physics is a very, very complicated field of study. And there is something called the superpositioning of particles, where you can have one particle in another galaxy in it's a different particle in another galaxy. So they're millions of light years away, billions of light years away. And the moment that you measure this particle, this particle over here immediately assumes the same measurement. So, like, let's just say it's like up or down. It's an atom. Let's just say it's like up or down, the direction that it's going. As soon as you measure this one over here and you measure that it's going up, this one over here suddenly is also going up. That's called like quantum entanglement. And another thing that the many worlds interpretation is getting at is it's getting at the idea that as soon as I measure something, all of the possibilities of that measurement collapse down into the single one that's been measured. So if I'm like shooting array of electrons and there's like kind of a mirror and the electrons can go left or right, well, as soon as I measure that the electrons have gone right, all of the possibilities of the directions of those electrons collapse down into one wave function, which is that they've gone right. Well, the many worlds height interpretation would say that there exists a universe in which those electrons did go left, or they did go straight, or they did go up, or they did go down. And that when I measure this particle over here and it's going up, and then this one immediately goes up, there's a universe where I measure this particle over here and it's actually going down, and this one's going down. So that's my very like simplistic interpretation. That's my very simplistic explanation of what the many worlds interpretation would be in quantum physics. Um, in quantum physics, particles exist in superpositions, like we just talked about, multiple possible states all at once, up, down, left, right, but they exist in that state until they're measured. The Copenhagen interpretation says that wave function collapses into one result. Everett is the man in 1957 who first coined the many worlds interpretation. His idea is that instead of collapsing, all outcomes actually happen, but they happen in different intersecting realities. Well, there's a problem with the other worlds hypothesis, and it's a problem that's pervasive of pretty much every single variation of the many worlds hypothesis in science. And it's that the other worlds can't really be observed. Right? I can't observe the universe where that electron was up instead of down. I can't observe the universe where the outcomes that weren't measured exist. I can only observe the universe where the outcome that was measured does exist. Without testable predictions that differ from other interpretations, it remains a theoretical stance, much less the scientific one. Now, when I say many worlds, most of you, I would argue, and this is goes for me as well, would be thinking of the multiverse hypothesis. So the many worlds interpretation has to deal with quantum physics specifically, but the multiverse theory is the same idea, but in cosmology. So in the study of the origins of the universe itself. So it states that at the moment of the Big Bang, the creation event, the explosion, at the moment of the Big Bang, an infinite number of possible universes were created. They came into existence, each with different physical constants of their own. Now, there's different models or different theories, I should say, on how exactly this occurred. One is the internal inflation model. Some inflationary models predict that while our observable universe popped out of inflation, so it just quickly expanded from nothingness, other regions of that space kept inflating, which eventually created bubbles. So if you imagine blowing a bubble really, really, really fast, this really, really big bubble forms, but there's also other areas on the surface of that bubble where other bubbles just suddenly popped into existence. That's what the eternal inflation model would be saying. That as our universe expanded, it was expanding so fast that there were other pockets of that bubble that formed other universes. String theory landscape, it allows many possible vacuum states. Vacuum states, they're a very complicated and difficult thing to explain, so I'm not going to attempt that here. But these vacuum states, the fluctuations of these vacuum states are what brought matter into being. And they suggest that different universes could exist in parallel in different vacuum fluctuation states. Um, you know, Another thing is called anthropic reasoning. This is another, I guess, line of a logic or a line of thinking that often leads people to the multiverse. And it would state that the multiverse helps explain why our universe's constants appear finely tuned for life. We're gonna get more into that in just a second. The multiverse is a great theory, but it suffers from the same problems that the many worlds hypothesis does. In fact, given that the multiverse is a response to classical modern our classical models of the origin of the universe, it would seem more likely that the multiverse is a well crafted attempt at circumventing the observational and mathematical conclusions that the universe had a beginning and is highly improbable to exist on its own. In other words, the multiverse theory is a reductionist response to fine tuning. Now, what do I mean by that? I'll say it this way. Okay. There's a really wonderful book. Trying to see if it's on my shelf. It is on my shelf. I just don't know at what point it's on my shelf. Uh, really, really great book called The Privileged Planet. And it was authored by Jay Richards and Guillermo Gonzalez, I believe. And it's a really wonderful book. And it came out a while ago, but there's been multiple editions that have come out since. And it describes what's called the fine tuning argument. So the fine tuning parameters. And essentially what it is fine tuning is a way of looking at the universe and asking, how probable is it that intelligent life exists at all? And it turns out that it's extremely highly improbable. And what we mean by fine tuning parameters is, I'll just give you a few examples. Cosmological constant. So the cosmological constant is the rate at which the universe is expanding. If you didn't know, the universe is expanding. I know it's a lot to take in, but the universe is expanding. So just so you know, the rate at which it is expanding is called the cosmological constant. It governs the rate of expansion of the universe. If it were slightly larger, so if it were slightly faster, the universe would expand too quickly for galaxies to form. In fact, it would expand too quickly for galaxies and solar systems and planets to coalesce into planetary bodies. If it was weaker, so if it was slower, the universe would have collapsed back in on itself under its own gravitational weight. So there wouldn't be enough energy to actually pull apart enough to give enough space away from the gravitational pull of the universe for those galaxies to have formed. Our universe's cosmological constant is extremely close to zero, but not only zero, it is a balance that permits long-lived stars and galaxy formation. The second one was the strength of gravity. The gravitational constant is finely balanced, right? If gravity was just a little bit stronger than it is, then stars would burn out too fast and they would collapse into black holes very easily. If gravity was weaker than it is, and when we talk about the gravitational constant, we're not talking about the gravity on Earth. We're talking about what makes gravity wherever you are on any sort of body that has a gravitational pull. But if it was weaker, stars couldn't ignite, they couldn't have nuclear fusion. Third is the electrical force, the electromagnetic force that determines how atoms bond to each other. And a slight change in the fine structure of the constant would make chemistry impossible. The strong nuclear force. It's what holds atomic nuclei together. If it were slightly weaker, protons and neutrons wouldn't bind. If it was too strong, almost all of hydrogen would fuse in the Big Bang, leaving no long-lived stars. The weak nuclear force regulates nuclear fusion and radioactive decay. If it's too strong, stars burn their fuel too quickly. If it's too weak, there's not enough fusion. Ratio of proton to neutron mass. The neutron is slightly heavier than the proton. If the balance were off, hydrogen, the simplest and most abundant element, also called the beryllic element, would be unstable, and stars, chemistry, and water could not even exist. There's the ratio of electromagnetic to gravitational forces, the initial conditions of the universe, carbon and oxygen production, or the Hurl resonance, and the list goes on and on and on. These are what we call fine-tuning parameters. These are parameters which must exist, the initial conditions which must exist in order for intelligent life to exist like it does here on Earth. The basic idea is that these features must fall within a very narrow range of possible values for chemical-based life to be possible. And there are dozens upon dozens upon dozens of fine-tuning parameters. And keep in mind, each and every one of these parameters has to be specifically tuned to where it is at in order for intelligent life. If any one of these parameters is off by the fraction of a fraction of a fraction, intelligent life would not be possible on Earth as it is. And physics, right? Like mathematical constants, they're not the only fine tuning parameters. Steady plate tectonics with the right kind of geological interior, such as that found on Earth, the right amount of water in the crust, a large moon with the right rotational period, proper concentration of sulfur, right planetary mass, near inner edge of circumstellar habitable zone. So where our solar system is located, where our Earth is located in the solar system, as well as where the solar system is located within the spiral arms of the Milky Way galaxy. Low eccentricity orbit, outside spin orbit, and giant planet resonances. A few large Jupiter mass planetary neighbors and large circular orbits. Outside spiral arm of galaxy, near rotation circular of galaxy, or circular orbit around galactic center. During the cosmological habitable age. What does that mean? During the point at which the stars are still forming and stars are still young enough to actually support planetary systems like the one that we find ourselves in. The polarity of the water molecule is a finely tuned constant and is a finely tuned parameter. Gravitational constant, that's the ones we've talked about. And the list again goes on: the velocity of light, the mass extinction of neutrons over protons, the ratio of masses of protons and electrons, the right amount of water in the Earth's crust. I think we already mentioned that. The right planetary mass. And the list again goes on. So why does this matter? Like why is this an important thing? Because there's different cosmological models that we talk about when we talk about the origin of the universe and everything in it. You see, natural philosophy hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, beginning with the Greeks, they believed that the universe was eternal. So they believed that the universe has simply existed forever. Well, nobody really believes that today. In the scientific community, I would be. I obviously think that maybe there are still some people that would argue that, but the majority, I would say, no longer believe that. There's mathematical reasons why an actual infinite set is illogical and inconsistent. You could talk about oh man, what was the name of that hotel? Something hotel argument, which talks about an actual infinite set of things and how there's contradictions and paradoxes. The hotel paradox. There are a lot of examples of why our universe, could not be infinite. Also, Edwin Hubble, who first discovered that the universe is expanding. He's the first one who discovered that universe expanding by measuring the light from distant galaxies and noticing that the light over time was getting redshifted, so that it was getting further away from us. And so if the universe is expanding, then therefore there has to be a point in the past at which the universe was not expanding and it was just one singularity. There are a plethora of examples, scientific, observational, and mathematical reasons why we can very, very safely argue that the universe did indeed have a beginning. And one of the issues with that is, well, if the universe had a beginning, then where did it come from? Right? Because if the universe had a beginning, there is a point where there is no universe, and then there's a point where there is a universe. And something had to have happened in between that in order to bring the universe into existence. And the problem is things don't cause their own existence. There was a point in time where I did not exist. Then there was a point in time in which I did exist. I did not bring myself into existence. I don't have the causal agency in order to do so. In fact, nothing that I know of on Earth, nothing that I know of in our solar system, nothing that I know of in our entire universe has the potential to bring itself into existence. Therefore, the universe itself could not have brought itself into existence. And that presents a problem. Because if I'm working from a purely naturalistic paradigm, so if the scientific paradigm from which I am working is purely naturalistic and reductionist, so I am only willing to accept hypotheses and causes that are methodologically natural. the natural processes, natural causes, nothing that is outside of that, well, that's a problem because guess what natural causes are contained in? Well, they're contained in the universe, right? So if all natural causes function and perform within the universe that we exist in, and the universe itself could not have caused itself to come into being, well, then those natural causes could not have caused the universe to come into being. Well, that presents a problem for methodological naturalism, and it presents a problem for materialism. So what do we do with that? The fine tuning argument and all those fine tuning parameters that I just kind of listed some of them for you. That is the argument that argues against the idea that the argument that the a universe could have just assembled itself into existence. You see, the more the more you dive into the conversations around many worlds and the multiverse hypothesis, the more you realize that the multiverse hypothesis is really a reaction to the fine tuning of the universe, and that if I'm a committed materialist and I look at the world and I only see material causes, I see natural processes, material causes. That's all the only explanations I'm willing to accept. I cannot accept that the universe truly came from nothing. I have to find a way to explain how our universe got here without adding in the qualifier that the universe had to have been eternal in eternal past, because it's been well proven that the universe came into existence. And the multiverse hypothesis is a way around that. It's a way around the awkward conclusion that if the universe had a beginning, therefore something or someone had to have brought it into being. You see, the fine-tuning argument, I think you know very well what I'm getting at here. The fine-tuning argument is an argument for the existence of God. It's an argument for the existence of some creative agency, some creative force which brought into being the universe from nothing. It's an argument which says that the universe simply could not have caused itself to come into existence given the vast amount of constants and variables that had to be in the right condition in order for the universe to exist, in order for our Earth to exist, in order for us to exist. So, therefore, something very powerful, creative, intelligent, outside and beyond the universe, which exists on its own nature. So it has necessary existence. So it exists on its own rather than being contingent on something else for its existence. That agency is what created the universe. And that is a very awkward conclusion for materialists because it requires accepting that there are immaterial metaphysical explanations for questions in science. There are metaphysical explanations that make more sense than naturalistic ones. When I say make more sense, I mean you look at the evidence and you draw a conclusion, and the most likely conclusion that you could draw from there being such a large degree of extremely fine-tuned variables, the most likely conclusion is that it was created, not that it came into being from nothing and was and evolved through random mutation and natural selection. So that's what makes the conversation around the multiverse adds a little different nuance to the conversation, because now you start looking at it as, oh, well, it's just one of many different. I mean, the steady state model, there were many different models that all attempted to explain where the universe could have come from within a naturalistic framework and throughout the 20th century. And the multiverse was just one of them. So that's a short scientific perspective. Multiverse doesn't just have scientific challenges. Universes outside our own are causally disconnected from us, and there's no light or signal can cross between them. So if universes can never be observed, then the multiverse may not be a scientific theory. We can't really observe it. We can't falsify whether or not it's true. And it's the same thing with the many worlds interpretation in quantum physics. But the problem is that it's adding more questions than it solves. I mean, Occam's razor says sometimes the simplest explanation is the most obvious one. If I walk into my house and I see that the couch is just torn to shreds and there's couch filling and material all over the place, and I see a dog sitting on my couch with a couch cushion in its mouth, the most obvious conclusion, the one that requires less steps to get to, is that the dog ripped apart my couch. But if I were to say, well, you know what I think really happened? I think a tornado spawned within my living room because of the conditions of my air conditioner. And with the tornado that spawned took up my couch and ripped apart the cushions very violently and gently set it back down in the place that it was. And my dog just happened to be at the scene of the accident as I walked in. That is a very unlikely conclusion. It requires additional steps of presumption and belief in order for me to actually come to that conclusion. Now, the simplest explanation is that my dog ripped up the couch. The simplest explanation for the fine tuning of the universe is that something created it, that something made the variables, right? It's like a car. A car is a very fine tuned piece of equipment. I mean, has a lot of very finely tuned aspects to it: tires, headlights, fuel pumps, the brakes, the steering wheel. All parts of a car are tuned specifically for their task and for a purpose and for a reason. I would never look at a car and say that, well, that car just kind of assembled itself, right? There was a block of metal in the junkyard that fell and it kind of rolled down a hill of other junk. And as it did, it slowly coalesced into a 2025 a Chevy Corvette. I wouldn't say that, and I hope you wouldn't either. Um, and so I think Occam's razor is applied here. While it's appealing and it makes great sci-fi, because it really does, multiverse theory really does make great sci-fi. I think it's more apparent that it's an attempt at explaining away fine tuning and explanations that aren't materialistic than it is a serious scientific theory. That's just my perspective. Um, Again, I'm not a quantum theorist. I'm not a scientist specifically, um, but I think that that's how I would wrestle or how I would interpret the question from a scientific perspective. That there's really not a lot of evidence that would like genuinely support that there are other universes and that there's other worlds that actually exist out there, and that if we look at the structure of scientific theories and the framework on which they're built, I think it becomes more obvious that theories like the multiverse are in one very big sense, they are a response to things like the fine tuning of the universe. They are a response to arguments and paradigms that would absolutely argue that the universe had a beginning and it's so finely tuned that it had to have been created by an intelligent mind. I think that's how I would look at it scientifically. Well, philosophically is a little different. It's a little different of a question. The many worlds hypothesis is a concept that's talked about in philosophy. Alvin Plantinga, he's a well-known Christian philosopher, and he argued that if we accept the many worlds hypothesis, then it serves as actually a proof for God rather than a disproof. Well, and what's interesting is if you think about the many worlds hypothesis. So imagine that there's an infinite number of possible worlds. Well, if I, could say, does evil exist? Well, if there's an infinite number of worlds, would evil have to exist on all of the worlds or just like some of them? Okay. Well, what about God? And here is where we take into consideration Anselm's argument for the greatest conceivable being. And Saint Anselm, actually don't know when he lived, so I'd have to look that up. But he was around the time of Aquinas, as far as I know. He maybe could have even been before Aquinas, but one of his arguments, his philosophical arguments for God, was called the greatest conceivable being. And simply put, I won't get into the argument too deeply, but one of the things that he put simply was, if God exists, then God, therefore, must be, by definition, the greatest possible conceivable being that we could even imagine. And if I can imagine a being that was even greater than that being, then that being must be God by definition. And one of the things that he says is, he says, well, that being that you're thinking about is only in your head. And there must be a being which not only exists in your head, but also exists in real life. And that being would be God. So therefore, God must exist because it is greater to exist in reality than it is to exist in thought. At its fundamental basis, that's just Anselm's argument. Plantinga would say that even if there are many worlds, even if we accept it and say, yeah, there's an infinite number of worlds, it is greater for a being to exist in every world rather than some worlds. Because if every possible world exists, right, an infinite number of universes, I imagine that there must be a universe where God does exist. Because at the very least, regardless of how uh, atheistic or materialistic you might be, you can't argue that there isn't at least some good argumentation and evidence for God, even if it's not convincing to you. Well, if that's the case, then there must be a universe, if there's an infinite number of them, where God really does exist, considering how much people argue for his existence in the universe that we do live in. And if that's true, if there's a universe where he does exist, then he is the greatest conceivable being, like Anselm said. And if he is the greatest conceivable being in that universe, well, I can conceive of a being greater than that, which exists in every universe. Therefore, if many worlds exist, God must exist on all of them. That is Anselm's interpretation of or one of the arguments that he makes in uh, the many worlds hypothesis in philosophy, talking about Anselm. Wonderful argument. Um, Wonderful to think about as well. Um, I love that argument. I love Anselm's argument, which is kind of funny because it's one of the most difficult. I think it's one of the most difficult to wrap your head around. It's not like the cosmological argument. I think that Anselm's argument from being is like his ontological argument from being. I think is hard to wrap your head around, but it's such a simplistic argument. I think that's what I like about it. Once you wrap your head around it. So that's the philosophical perspective on how I think I would wrestle with the question philosophically. But as usual, we come to what a biblical perspective might be. What might the Bible have to say about do many worlds exist? Um, and I think it's pretty unequivocal. I think it's pretty clear what the Bible has to say. It doesn't hold anything like a many worlds hypothesis or a multiverse. In fact, the Bible gives no indication that there are extant universes apart from our own, apart from the one that we experience. The Bible does, however, repeatedly support the idea that there are many realms or realities. These realities are not physical in nature, so they're separate from the multiverse or the many worlds interpretation. And we have a few examples of scripture that talk about these realms. Okay, so this is what I was talking about when I said that there is a different way of interpreting the question itself. So, what we just wrestled with for about 40 minutes was the interpretation that there are different actual physical universes apart from our own, which actually exist. Now, when it comes to a biblical perspective, the Bible would argue, well, there's not but the Bible doesn't argue that there's actual different physical universes which actually exist, but it would say, well, but there are different like realities or frequencies or whatever word you want to use to describe them. There are different realms of existence. And here's a few examples from scripture. Colossians 1:16, for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. So there we go. We have a dichotomy. We have a sort of a two perspectives, heaven and earth, invisible and visible. 2 Corinthians 4:18. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Once again, here Paul is sharing with us that there are two realities or two realms that the Bible talks about. There's the seen and the unseen. There's the temporary and eternal. Ephesians 6:12, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms, a different realm. Throughout Scripture, prophets like Isaiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel all had visions of heaven, a different realm. All had visions of heaven or God's throne. Isaiah 6 is one of the great examples. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings, with which they covered his face, and 2 with which he covered his feet, and 2 with which he flew. We are even given a scene of another realm, from which can be assumed as the throne room of God. We're given a scene of another realm in Job 1. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Does Job fear God? For nothing, Satan replied. Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, very well, then everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. A depiction, a little scenario there playing out in the throne room of God. In the New Testament, Paul has a vision or an out-of-body experience or possibly a near-death experience. I actually might argue that. In 2 Corinthians 12, 2 through 4, I know a man, Paul's talking about himself here. You got to remember this book is 2 Corinthians. He's talking about humility, radical humility. And so the reason why Paul's talking about himself here in the third person is because he's trying to stay as humble as he can possibly stay. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. Paul here has an experience of a different realm, a different reality, a different existence 14 years ago. So it definitely left quite the impression. And lastly, Jesus himself repeatedly indicated that there is more than just the reality in which we live. John 18:36, before Pilate, Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders, but now my kingdom is from another place. John 8:23, to the Pharisees, he says, you are from below. I am from above. You are of this world. I am not of this world. And in John 17:14 through 6, he's praying for his disciples. They are not of this world, even as I am not of it. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. So the Bible would argue, I think very clearly, that there's no reason to think that there's multiple universes or there is an infinite number of universes which exist. The Bible gives no indication of that. But it does give an indication that there are multiple realms. How many depends on your interpretation. Some would say that there's an intermediary place between here and hell. Some might call that purgatory. Some would say there's an intermediary place between here and heaven, or there was an intermediary place called Moses or Abraham's bosom. And some might argue that there's different levels to hell. Some would argue that there's different levels to heaven. As Paul said that he was caught up in the third heaven. What does he mean by that? So there may exist many multiple different realms, but at the very least, the Bible makes it very clear that at the very least, you can safely argue that there's two realms. There's the one which we live in currently, day by day, and experience. But then there's also one which is the immaterial realm, the unseen realm, the metaphysical realm. So those are my comments on the question, do many worlds exist? My final comments would be this. I think it's a really good question to consider and wrestle and think about. I think it's a really fun question. But I think it's important to keep in mind the philosophical presumptions and motivations that occur or take place for the question itself. Like the motivations behind multiverse theory, behind the many worlds interpretation and hypothesis. I think it's important to take into account the philosophical foundations and assumptions that are taking place behind the multiverse theory and behind the many worlds interpretation. Now, I'm not saying, like, I could be completely wrong, and tomorrow we just discover, yeah, there's like totally another universe out there. So I'm not saying that if you hold the view that, like, I'm not saying if you really believe in the multiverse theory that you're completely and utterly wrong. I'm saying that take into consideration the philosophical commitments that science takes in order to make the multiverse theory like possible, or what it considers to be possible. Um, because I think it's important to see where the motivations are for developing certain specific theories. And in science, a lot of the times, not all the time, maybe not even most of the time, maybe a lot of the time, a lot of the theories that you'll find have philosophical motivations behind them. That they are purely devoted to methodological naturalism. They're purely devoted to reductionistic material explanations, and a hypothesis like the multiverse comes out into being because there is some sort of alternative framework within science that is seeking to explain things outside of material causes, which is threatening the paradigm on which the scientific establishment stands and sits. And as a result, many opposing theories come out of the woodwork in order to challenge this theory that is challenging the establishment. So that's what I would say. I think that again, I think it makes great sci-fi. Um, makes wonderful sci-fi. Um, but I don't see necessarily the evidence that there are many possible worlds, that there's an infinite number of universes. I don't. There's no substantial evidence, none that I have found. I would say none that I have found. And as a Christian, speaking from looking through the Bible, I don't see evidence for it in the Bible as well. Um, but I do see evidence in the Bible that there are different realms, realms which exist. Maybe there's one, maybe there's two, maybe there's three. I don't know for sure how many different realms there are, but I know that at the very least there's two: the one we live in, and the unseen one where the throne of God is. So those are my comments on today's question. I would love to hear what you have to say. Do multiple worlds exist? Is there evidence? Is there evidence for the multiple worlds interpretation and the multiverse theory? Is there evidence that I've overlooked? I would love to hear what that evidence is. I would love to hear your perspective on the multiverse theory and what you have to say. And I just want to thank you for joining me tonight for Adam Answers Anything. It's been a great night. 11th episode answering this question: do multiple worlds exist? Don't forget to leave a comment, like, and subscribe. It really helps. And I love all of you so much. And I hope you have a wonderful and awesome rest of your week. Again, happy Labor Day. And thanks for joining me. You have a great night.